let's start the CSS Grid part of the course by taking a look at what CSS grids actually are, how they work, and why we need them. So, what are these CSS grids that everyone talks about so much these days? Well, the CSS Grid layout is a brand new module that brings a two-dimensional grid system to CSS for the very first time. And there really has never been anything like this before in CSS. So this is a real game changer, because it changes everything: how we think about layout, how we write our CSS, and even how we write our markup in HTML. All of that is much easier and more logical too with CSS grids. And so we can now finally design much more complex layouts, because we now have the tools to actually build them in our code with CSS Grid. And that actually also holds true for Flexbox, which works very well together with CSS grids, where Flexbox can handle the one-dimensional layouts and grids the two-dimensional layout parts. Together, these two new technologies solve all the layout problems that we could never really solve before, at least not in a clean and straightforward way. So, by having native grids now right in our browser, we can even throw CSS frameworks like Bootstrap out the window, because CSS is now the framework itself. We don't need to be bound by a simple and boring 12-column layout anymore, like Bootstrap and all these other frameworks. We're free to do whatever we want, because it's now so simple to implement without any weird hacks in our CSS or even HTML code. So building a simple two-dimensional layout like this one, which we're actually going to build in our grid project, by the way, becomes really simple and straightforward with CSS grids. It all just works a bit different than the way we've been doing it for so long now with float layouts and other hacks. And that's why I say that CSS Grid requires a whole new mindset, a whole new way of thinking about design, HTML and CSS. These are really exciting times to be a CSS developer, and I can't wait to show you how grids actually work. But before we can jump into the code, we need to talk a bit about the terminology around CSS grids. And this is a bit similar to the Flexbox terminology, but actually a lot more complex at the same time. So, just like we have a Flex container in Flexbox, in CSS grids we have a grid container. And we create a new grid container by setting the display property of an element to grid. Simple as that. Then, all the direct children of the grid container are the grid items. We also have axes, like in Flexbox, with the difference that these are called the row axis in the x direction and the column axis in the y direction. And these axes are always the same. We cannot change where they are like we do with Flexbox, which makes it a bit simpler actually. So, row axis and column axis. But there's actually a lot more we need to know. So first, the vertical and horizontal lines that divide up the grid and separate the columns and the rows are called the grid lines. And they are automatically numbered for the columns as well as for the rows, starting from 1 all the way to the number of rows plus 1, and the number of columns plus 1, of course. Now, the actual space that is between the rows and columns is called the gutter, and the row gutter can be different from the column gutter. So, what are the grid rows and columns actually? Well, the space between two grid lines is called a track, no matter if it's vertical or horizontal. If it's horizontal, then it's called a row, of course, and if it's vertical, then it's called a column. Simple as that. But it gets better, because there is more. So the area between two vertical and two horizontal grid lines is called a grid area. And if that area is between two adjacent grid lines and two adjacent column lines, then that area is just called a grid cell. Okay, so I know that this is a lot to take in, so don't worry all too much about it at this point. Because with time, this will all come naturally to you, especially the grid lines, gutters, tracks, rows, and columns. Because we actually use these terms all the time when we start working with grids. And now, just to finish this lecture, this is just a quick overview of all the CSS Grid related properties for both the grid container and the grid items. Now, I will not go into explaining all of these properties at this point, because we're going to use them throughout the rest of the grid part of this course. And so you will certainly get familiar with all of them. So again, this is more intended like a reference that maybe you can even print out, like I actually did, because believe me, this comes in very handy when we first start using grids. So whenever you need to get a quick overview of all these grid properties, here they are. Alright, So that's a quick intro to what CSS grids are. So in this first intro section to CSS grids, we're going to code up some examples to learn the basics using CodePen, such as we did before in other sections. Now what's new is that we're actually going to use a new browser instead of Google Chrome, and that's the new Firefox Quantum, which has by far the best dev tools to work with CSS grids. And this makes it a lot easier to visualize what's going on when we lay out our grids, and so that's perfect for beginners like you. So let's just head over here to mozilla.org, like I already have, and then download the new Firefox. I already did that, of course, and I played around a lot with the new dev tools with CSS grids here, and as I said, they are really great for working with grids. So the new Firefox browser is the first tool that we're going to use throughout this course instead of Google Chrome, and the second tool is again CodePen, as I was mentioned before. So you already know that to create a new CodePen, you just head over to codepen.io/pen. It's then going to ask you if you want to create a new account at some point, but that's not really necessary if you just want to follow along with the videos and just save the code. But if you want to create an account and make the editor look like this one, like I have here, then it's best to create an account. So just to show you the settings that I have here, so that you can make your CodePen look the same as mine here in the videos, I just head over here to the settings down here. And so what I have here is the Oceania Dark theme, together with the Source Code Pro font here, and a 15 pixel font size. All right, and so that's gonna look like this example here on the right side. Then down here I didn't change anything, so this is just the default settings. All right. So again, this last step here is not really necessary if you don't want to make your CodePen look the same as mine, okay? What really matters is that you have the Firefox browser all installed and working, so that in the next lecture we can start writing our first CSS grid code. Welcome back. Let's now finally get our hands dirty with CSS Grid for the very first time. And so here I already have a brand new CodePen open in Firefox, as you can see here. So we're working now in Firefox, as I was telling you in the last lecture. And you will actually see why in a second. So when we start using the Firefox dev tools. So let's start by closing this JavaScript editor here, because of course we don't need it. And now for a small example, let's start with some HTML. So we start with a element called container. Okay, and so we used Emmet throughout the course a lot, and it actually also works here in CodePen. And so I'm using that right now to write our markup. So we want the container element, which will actually be our grid container, and then in there we want to have a couple of items. So let's call them item, but I also want to give each of them an individual name. So item 1, and so you see we're using the BEM notation here again with this dash dash here, okay? Now I want this to happen 6 times. And so I simply can say times 6. And what this will do is that it will do 6 times this part here of the code. So we will have one container element with 6 items in there. Now the problem with this is that each of these 6 items will have the number 1 here, right? But we don't want that, and so we actually can do better. Because here in Emmet there's another trick that we can use, and that is to use the $sign basically. And so now this $sign will get replaced with the current number. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So let me show that to you when I now actually hit tab here. And so here we go. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So that's a very handy trick in Emmet that I wanted to show you. Let's now put some content here into this divs. And I'm going to put the number from 1 to 6 and then a color. And so these divs, they will later have these different colors. So orange, green, number 3, violet, pink for number 4, and then blue and brown. And brown. All right. And let's now actually save this. So I just hit the save button here, and then you see that this changes here the URL, right? And you see that I'm actually logged into my account. And so this CodePen will actually be available on my public CodePen profile if you want to check that out. So now about the CSS, let's give it some more space here on the side. And let's start by writing some simple styles for the container. So let's just give it some background color like EEE, and a width of 1000 pixels. So now we're not really worrying about using RAM and all that stuff. So we just want to make this work. We just want this to be like a small demo. Let's now also center this in the viewport. And for that we can use our old trick, 0 and auto. And actually let's put something like 30 pixels in here so that we get some space here between the top of this window and the container. Okay, and with that we're ready to start using grid. So how do we turn an element into a grid container? Well, very simple, display grid. And that's it. So now this is a grid container, but nothing really changed, right? And that's because we didn't define any columns or any rows. So that's what we're going to do next. And here is how it works in grid. So we have a property called grid template rows. And in here we can define our rows. So let's say we want these 6 elements here to be divided in 2 rows and 3 columns, okay? So that makes 6. 2 times 3 makes 6. So we want 2 rows and 3 columns. So what we do here is to define these 2 rows. So I say that the first one should be 150 pixels, and I say that the second one should be 150 pixels as well. And that's it. So that's how grid template rows works. We define basically the heights of our rows. So the first one should be 150 pixels and the second one as well. So simple as that. And now let's do the same thing for the columns. So grid template, and you can guess that this one is called grid template columns. So let's also do 150 pixels for now, and later we're going to change all of this. So this is just the very first approach. And all right, so we see here that they're actually now already laid out as a grid here. That's awesome, right? Now before we actually go inspect this here in the DevTools, let's add some colors here to these items so that we can better see what's going on. All right. So item. And so first of all, let's define some global styles for all of these items. So let's give them a padding of like 20 pixels, a font size of 30 pixels, a font family, and we simply say we want sans serif. Okay. And we say that the color should be white. Okay. And now the colors of these items. And actually we can use sass here again. So you can see here that this is actually SCSS, all right? And so we can construct our selectors like we've been using all the time in the project. Okay, so this here will mean item 1, right? Let's do this for all of them, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So item 2, item 3, item 4, 5, and 6. And let's just give them some quick colors. And my orange red again. Okay, so the first one will be orange. Let's quickly copy this here as well. This one will be yellow-green. Blue-violet. So these are just some built-in CSS colors, as you know already. This one is called pale violet red, so it is a kind of weird color. This one is royal blue, and then golden rod or something. All right, so now we can see that our grid is really laid out in a 3:2 fashion here with these squares, which are each 150 per 150 pixels, right? So just as we defined up here. And now let's actually inspect this here. And this works very similarly to Google Chrome. So we say inspect element. And let's now actually put this here on the side. So just hit this button here. And okay, so we have more space to actually see the grid. Now here in the markup, as you start hovering these items here, you see the lines in the page, right? So this is the grid container here, and then all of these grid items, right? But that's actually not the best part. because if we select the container here, we see here display grid, right? And when you click this item here, then you can actually see a nice grid overlay on the element. So we can now come here to this layout tab to see this even better. So this is our container that we have with our 6 items in there. And now we can display line numbers here, which makes it even better. And so now you see these line numbers. So remember from the first intro lecture where I told you that the column lines and the row lines get automatically numbered, right? And so here it is. 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is 3 columns plus 1, and then 1, 2, 3 for the lines. Okay, and so that makes it a lot easier to build CSS grids here using the inspector. We can actually also see the grid lines in here, like these dashed lines that you can see. Maybe it's not really visible right now, but you're going to see it a bit better in a second. Because let's now add another thing to our grid. So remember that I told you that we can also have space between the grid items, right? And that's called the gutter. So let's add grid row gap. And let's set it to 20 pixels. And what's going to happen? Yeah, here we have the gap now. Let's make it a bit bigger actually. So 30 pixels. And so this is the gap. We can of course also put a gap in the columns. So grid column gap, as you can guess, 30 pixels as well. And all right, once more the dev tools show us the gap here. And now you can also see the grid lines a bit better here, right? So delimiting here each of these grid items. So of course we can also change the column gap to something else than the row gap. So remember I mentioned that as well before. So we can have different gaps for the columns and for the rows, right? Now if you want to have the same gap for everything, we can simply use grid gap and set it to 30 pixels. And then it will all be the same. So let's comment out these ones here, just so you keep them here in the code, okay? Okay, and that's it. That is our very first CSS grid. You see how easy it was to put these 6 elements here in this very simple grid layout? No floats, no weird HTML tricks here, because imagine we wanted to do this very same layout without grid. We would have to have just a wrapper for these 3 items here, and then a wrapper for the second 3 items here, right? And that's really not practical at all. It's so much better laying these items out like this. So before ending this lecture, let's just very quickly recap what we did here. So we first set the display property to grid, and then we defined our rows, so the template rows for the grid. And in this case, we basically said that we want to have 2 rows, each of them with 150 pixels. We could also put the second one to 100 pixels, for example, and then, of course, it would become smaller. So the first value for the first row and the second value for the second row. And then, of course, the same for the columns. So we said we want 3 columns, basically each one with 150 pixels. And we can actually do a bit better here with this, but I'm going to show you that in the next lecture. For now, I just want you to get the basics really right, okay? So we defined our grid in terms of rows and columns, and then we also added some gaps here. So a row gap and a column gap, which can be different, but if we want them to be the same, we can simply use the grid gap property to set both of them at the same time. Then we also inspected them here in the DevTools. And don't forget to check this display line numbers box here, okay? So that you can actually see the line numbers, because we're going to need that in the next lecture. And that's it. That's the very fundamentals of CSS Grid. But there's a lot more, of course, a ton more to learn. And so I'm going to wait for you right in the next lecture. In this lecture, you will learn what the new fractional unit is and why it is so useful in CSS grids. So first off, I want to show you that we can do a bit better than having to define all of these rows here one by one. So imagine that we had 5 rows, each of them at 150 pixels. It wouldn't be really helpful to having to define all of them one by one like this, right? And that's why instead in CSS Grid we get a new function called repeat. And so let me show it to you how it works. So all we have to do is to write repeat, then the number of rows or columns that we want, so 2, and then we want both with 150 pixels. And that's it. So you see that we're back to having 2 rows here, each of them with 150 pixels. And so that is exactly the same as writing 150 and 150 as we had before. And the same, of course, could be done down here. So let's get rid of this. Repeat 3 and 150 pixels. So let's see. And alright, it looks just as before. Now imagine we wanted to have the third column with 300 pixels and not 150. How would we do that? Well, very simple actually. So just change this one here to 2, and then we can add whatever we want here. So let's say 300 pixels. And let's wait, and here we are. So what this does is that basically where it says repeat 2, it creates these 2 column tracks with 150 pixels each, and then the third one with 300 pixels, right? So remember again from the first lecture that these are called the tracks, right? So what we do here is to create 2 tracks for the rows and 3 tracks for the columns, right? So again, this is a track here, this is a track, this one is a track, and here, and here. Now, what if we wanted to make this last column here occupy the rest of our grid container? Because we see right now there's a lot of empty space here still, right? So how could we fill this up? So this is a bit similar to Flexbox, where we had, remember, the flex property, which if we would set it to 1, it would basically expand and occupy all the possible space. Now here in Grid, we don't have a property like that, but we have a similar functionality. So let me show you how. So what we're going to use is the brand new unit that was introduced with CSS Grids, which is called a fractional unit. So I can write 1 fractional unit like this, so FR, and what it does is that it expands to all the space that it can occupy. So in this case, it occupies all the remaining space. Okay, does that make sense? So let's take a look again at what happens here. So we defined the 3 column tracks. So the first one will have 150 pixels, the second one 150 as well, and the last one is 1 fractional unit. And the fractional unit represents a fraction of the available space. And so it takes all of that up when we set it here to 1 FR. Okay, so FR is very, very handy. And let me actually show you a different way of using it. So a different application, let's say. So let's create some new column tracks here. So I'm commenting out these ones so that you can keep them in the code for reference. So grid template columns. And let's say we want all of the 3 columns to have the same size. How do you think we would do that? Well, we can use our repeat function. Say we want 3 tracks, each of them with 1 FR. And that's it. So again, 1 FR is a fraction of the available space. And in this case, each of these 3 column tracks has the same width, right? So each of them is 1 FR. And so with this, we can divide the entire space in 3 parts. Okay, does that make sense? Maybe to understand it even better, let me show it to you in another way yet. So let's say we want the first one to be 1 fractional unit, the second one 2 fractional units, and the last one 1 fractional unit as well. So what do you think will happen? Okay, and so that's the result. So you see that this one here, the one in the middle, the column in the middle, the second one, is now double the size of the first one and the last one. So why is that? Well, that's because 2 is double of 1. And so all the empty space here is divided, and then 2 of the fractions are assigned to the second column, and then 1 is assigned to the first one, and 1 fraction is assigned to the last one. Let's actually inspect this here, so we can get the sizes. So the first one, you see that it has 235 pixels of width. And so the second one should have double, which should be 470, right? So let's take a look if that's true. And yeah, so you see it's 470 width and 150 height. And so that's exactly as predicted. And of course, the last one is 235. And we can, of course, take this even further. So let's set this one to 3. So what's going to happen now? Of course, it's going to get even bigger, because now the available space is basically divided in 5 parts, 3 for the column in the middle, and 1 for the left, and 1 for the right column, right? So you see that this fractional unit can actually be very, very helpful, right? And that's exactly why it was developed specifically for CSS grids. You can of course also put this one here to 3FR. And so now these two are both 3 times bigger than this first one, right? Now you can play around with this if you want, so to become a bit more familiar with it, because there's actually a lot to explore, right? So let's now set these back to 1, and let's experiment with something else. For example, let's set this one to 50%, because of course we cannot only use pixels and fractional units, we can use all kinds of units here, and percentage is no exception. So right now I set it to 50%. So let's inspect the width of this element here. And so you see that it has 500 pixels, which is exactly 50% of the 1000 pixels that the container has, right? So you see it has 1000 pixels of width. And so this item here with 50%, so that this entire column has now 500 pixels. So what we see immediately here from that is that this percentage unit here doesn't take the gap into account. Okay, so basically it takes 50% of the entire width, and then the rest is for the other columns, but also for the gap. So let's increase, for example, here this to 80, just to see what happens. And then you see that the first column stays exactly the same, and the second and the third column, they are the ones that become a bit narrower, because now we need more space here for the gap, right? And so the remaining space that's left is of course divided between these two, because they both have a 1 fractional unit. So this one and this one as well. If I put this one to 2, again, you can guess what will happen. And so yeah, the third column is twice as wide as the second one. Okay, but let's put this back to 30. I will actually comment this one out here so that you can also keep this code and then put it back to what we had before. So repeat, and then I want to make the 3 columns all with the same width. And so for that, again, we use our FR trick, so fractional unit. So this fractional unit here is something that you will see all the time when using CSS grids, okay? Especially for defining the column tracks, because this is really handy. But actually this also works as well here for the rows. So if we defined like a height for this container, let me just very quickly show it to you. So let's see, the height of the container should be 1000 pixels. So not 100, 1000 of course. So you see that now it comes all the way down here. And if we now were to put 1 FR here, then let's wait for it. Okay, now you see that each of the rows occupies all the space it can in order to fill up the entire height of the container, right? So the FR, of course, doesn't only work on columns, but I think it's way more useful there, okay? And you will see it and you will use it more on the columns. So let's put it back to where it was and comment out this code here, because this here is exactly what we want. All right, so I hope that the fractional unit here made a lot of sense to you. And if you need to experiment some more with it, then please go ahead, experiment, try to inspect the width of the columns like I did before, and make sure that you understand what the fractional unit really represents, okay? And once you're done with that, once you really got it down, then we can move on to the next lecture, where you're going to learn how to actually position these grid items exactly where you want them on the grid. Because right now, all of these items, they were just automatically placed in the order in which we have them here in the source code. But we can of course change that, right? So once you got this part really down, let's move on together to the next lecture. Let's continue working on our grid example and learn how we can position items wherever we want on the grid. So right now, all of our grid items are laid out according to their source order. So we start here in the beginning, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And that is because of CSS Grid's automatic placement algorithm. And so the default behavior is that the items are laid out just like they are in the code, which actually makes a lot of sense. But now imagine that you actually have to place a grid item somewhere else. So let's position this first one here, the orange one, right here. So right here in this grid cell. So remember what a grid cell is? It is the area between two adjacent row and column lines, right? So here we have the column line number 2 and the one number 3. And here we have the row line number 2 and row line number 3. And so this area here is called a cell. So what we want to do now is to put this item here, this grid item number 1, into this cell, right? And how can we do that? Well, that's where these numbers here actually come into play. So the column and the row line numbers. So let's come here to our item number 1 and let's define a couple of properties. So we start with grid row start. And so that's the number of the row line in which we want this to start. So right now, remember, we want to put this item here in this cell. And so it starts here at line number 2. And so we simply put 2. All right. And you already saw that the element moved here to the second row, right? So without even doing anything else. But we can do grid row end and set it to 3. So that's then a cleaner solution. So with this code here, we say that the item should be placed in a cell which starts by row line number 2 and ends at row line number 3. Okay, and so already this item moved here to the second row, and then the other items move up in the same order in which they were before. So 2, 3, 4, and then the number 1, and then 5 and 6. So that's again the automatic placement algorithm here. Now next, and you can probably already guess, is grid column start. Okay, and so that's the number 2 as well. So number 2, and here we go. So now it's exactly in the cell that we wanted it to. Just to finish this one here, and number 3 as well. So it starts at row line number 2 and 3, and also at column line number 2 and 3. And so now we placed our item exactly in this grid cell. Now this is a lot of code here to write, and so that's actually a bit easier way to do it. So let's just comment it here for the moment. And instead we can simply write grid row and then 2 and 3. And so this is where it starts and where it ends. Okay, so this is like a shorthand for these two properties. And then the same with the column. Grid column 2 and 3 as well. And so here we are back to the cell. Okay, and now that you know how it works, let's do the same for another one. So let's position this number 5 item here into this grid cell here. So how do we do that? Well, let's come here to number 5 and then grid row. And which one is it now? So remember, right now it's here in the second row, so between 2 and 3. But we want it to be between 2 and 1. And 2 and 1. And that's it. And now it moves, of course, here to the first position, because we haven't yet specified the column. So grid column 3 and 4, as you can see here from these line number indicators. And so that's why I was saying that it's so important and so useful to having these line numbers here right with the DevTool, so here with the inspector. And that's just something that Google Chrome doesn't do at the moment. It probably will do sometime in the future, but right now only Firefox does this. And that's exactly why we're using it. Now, if writing these two properties here is still too much for you, we can actually do it in also another way. So let's comment this out again. And remember how grid row and grid column are just a shorthand for grid row start, grid row end, column start, and column end. But there's actually a shorthand even for these two. So we can say grid area instead. And then here we specify the line number where we want it to start, then the column number where we want it to start. So that would be here the number 3, right? And then the line where it ends and the column where it ends. So I think this is a bit confusing actually. And so I personally do prefer this way here of writing it out, okay? And so in the future, this is how I'm going to do it instead of using the grid area property. But I just wanted to show you that there is another way, and there are actually more ways of positioning items. But this one is the most straightforward and the most easy to use, okay? So again, There will be other ways of positioning items that I'm going to show you later in the course, but for now, please just know that this is the easiest way, and this is the one that I want you to understand right now. Okay? And also you can understand this even a bit better, I want you to position one of these items all by yourself without looking at the code. Okay? So let's scroll down here a bit, and now without looking at the code, I want you to position this number 6 item right here. Okay? So you think you can do that? Well, just pause the video and please try to do it on your own without looking at the code. Okay, so you managed to do that. So here's the solution. So grid row is just 1 and 2, right? And so you already see it now moving up to the first line. And now for the column, grid column, and 2, 3. And here we go. So now you know how to position these items exactly where you want them. But that's more. We can actually do a lot more, okay? So we can span these elements here, for example, over multiple rows or multiple columns. So imagine we wanted to have this blue element here spanning all over these 2 cells here. So this entire area. We can do that, of course, also with grids. And it's actually something really, really important. So without that, grids actually wouldn't make much sense. So if you want to learn how to do that, then just click on that next lecture. Let's now learn how to span grid items across multiple grid cells in order to occupy entire areas. So suppose you wanted this violet element here not only to occupy this single cell here, but to span across these 2 cells here, so occupying this entire area. How would you go about doing that? And actually, it's really not hard. So remember that we learned how to use grid row and grid column, right? So far, we only placed grid items into single cells. And so the end is always the beginning plus 1, right? So 2 and 3. And the columns also from 2 to number 3. So only 1 column, and here only 1 row. But what if we put a higher number here, like a number 4 here? Well, if we did that, then the element would simply occupy more space. So let's actually do that here with the number 1, which is this orange here. And so let's say that we wanted to start at column number 2 and end at column number 4. So what happens then is this. So here we go. Now it occupies both of these cells, spanning all the way from line number 2 to line number 4. Now what about this grid item that was here before? Well, it simply moved down here, because that's what the CSS Grid algorithm does. So if we have more items than we actually define cells here, then CSS Grid will automatically add a new row or a new column, but in this case just a new row. And this part here is then called an implicit grid, okay? But that's something to talk about later, because I don't want to confuse you, okay? So for now, just note that if we span these items here and we end up with more items than we have space, then there will simply be created a new line, okay? But let's put this back to 3 as we had it before, and then do this with the violet one as we were saying in the beginning. So all we have to do is to say grid column, and remember we wanted to go from here spanning these 2 cells. So very easy, 1, 3. And where did it go? Well, actually it moved down here. And can you guess why? Well, it's because we also placed this element explicitly here in this cell, right? So the item number 1, the orange here, is placed exactly here. And so if we want to put this one here in the same place, then this item here will try to find a new place, okay? Unless we explicitly tell it to stay in this exact row where we wanted it to be. So let's also say grid row and say 2, 3. And so now you see that it moved here where it was before. And what happened now to the orange one? Well, it simply got hidden behind this one here. So what this means is that we can actually have multiple grid items in the same cell. So right now we have the orange one here in this cell, so here behind the violet one, and then we have the violet one on top of all of this, occupying these 2 cells. Okay, and this is something really important to remember, okay? So we can always have multiple grid items in the same cell. Now, if you wanted this orange one here to be on top and to be visible, all we have to do is to set its z-index to some value, like let's say 10, and then you will see it move on top, okay? So very simple. And this is actually a technique that is used quite a lot with CSS grids, like for image galleries or stuff like that, where we can have elements overlying each other to create some great effects like this, okay? Now, of course, we can do the same with rows. So let's come here to element number 5, and instead of ending here at row line number 2, let's make it end on row line number 3. So right here. And all right, so you see here now that it spans these 2 grid cells here, right? So that's one way of spanning elements across multiple cells. But there's actually another way. And so let me demonstrate that one to you as well. And I'm going to do that with this one here, with the green one. So number 2. And actually this is not even positioned at all. So that's perfect to show you how it works. So we can simply say grid column again. And so suppose that we want it to be from here to here. So we could say, of course, 1 and 3, like we did before, and that would do the job. And so where is it now? Yeah, so it moved down here now again, because of the same reason that we had before, because this one here is placed explicitly here at this point, right? So you see here, we placed it right here, and so this element then moved down here. But right now that's not a problem, just to explain it to you. So instead of writing 1 and 3 here, we can simply say that we want it to span across 2. And that will do the exact same thing. And we can say 3, of course. And then what happens is that it's going to span across 3 grid cells. So 1, 2, and 3. And that's what this 3 here means. Okay? Of course, we could also start this here with number 2 and then span all the way until number 2, or actually all across 2 grid cells. So starting from number 2 here across 2 grid cells. Now maybe you noticed before when we had the number 3 here, you saw what happened. So basically it created a new column here, a column that is completely empty because we didn't define any width for it, but it still tried to kind of create a new column there. So that's not a good idea. And so if we're not really sure what to put here, there's actually still another way. So number 2 here is what we wanted, so to span across 2, but let's actually do it even in another way. So grid column, starting from number 2, and now let's pretend that we don't remember how many columns we have. All we know is that we want it to be all until the end. And in order to represent the end, all we have to do is to say -1. Okay, and that's it. Now it goes from column line number 2 all the way until the end. And that's what this -1 here represents. Okay, so instead of hard coding here how many cells we want to occupy, we simply put -1 and then it goes all the way until the end. Because suppose that we wanted to start it in number 1, and if we had span 2 here before, so if we had this, then now we had to change it to 3, right? And if we changed our mind again and wanted to be from 2 until the end, then we would have to change both again. But with -1, that doesn't happen, okay? So no matter what we put here, we can put 1 and it goes until the end. We can put 2 and it goes all the way until the end, and even 3. So from 3 to 4 here, right? So that is another very handy trick here with the -1. Okay, so spanning, we used basically 3 different ways. First, we simply defined the end number of the row or the column line. Then, as a second way, we used the span keyword, which is actually better. And then finally, as a third method, whenever we want to span all the way until the end of our grid, we can simply use -1. And of course, this not only works for columns, but also for rows. All right. Now, right now here, this looks like a huge mess, but don't worry about that, okay? All I wanted to do here is to simply show you is how we can span or grid items across multiple cells in order to occupy entire areas like this, okay? And I hope that came across to you so that you really understood how all of this works, the different tools that we have at our disposal. So like using grid row start, row end, column start, or column end, or by using grid row and grid column, or even by using grid area like we have somewhere down here. Yeah, so here. So that's all that matters here in this lecture, that you really understood how we use all of these properties to come up with the layouts and the designs that we want, okay? So don't worry about how it looks, just worry about what you just learned, hopefully, in this lecture. So again, I really encourage you to play around with all of these properties that I just show you, maybe build your own small grid and some more items in it, and try to come up with some creative ways of using spanning like I just showed you here in this video. Okay, and that's it actually for this example. These were the very basics, but of course, once more, there's a lot more to learn. And so we will continue with this intersection in the next video. Hey there! So after our very first, very small grid demo, I now have a small challenge for you so that you can immediately apply what you just learned in the last couple of lectures. And this is the challenge. So right here I have a small layout with a medium complex structure. And what I want you to do is to simply recreate this entire layout using CSS Grid. So that shouldn't be all too hard after what you just learned, right? So just a couple of notes here. For example, note that this column here on the right side with the sidebar is slightly more narrow than these three columns here, okay? So you can try to define the size of this column here, so the width of this track, and then divide the remaining space through the other columns, the other tracks, right? So I'm sure you already know how to do that. Then in these other elements here, like the header and the footer and the content, you'll also have some spanning going on, as you can probably already see, right? Then you also have this gutter here, and it's actually the same gutter for the rows and for the columns. So that should be really simple as well to you. Now this layout is a layout that would have been extremely difficult to make it right using the old school CSS techniques like float layouts. But with CSS Grid, you're gonna see how easy it is to implement this kind of layout. And this actually looks already like a real world layout, right? So this could perfectly be like a blog or something like that, right? So imagine this is a blog with a header, then 3 featured posts, then here a main post, a footer here down here with info about the site, and then here, of course, a sidebar with the usual stuff that you see in a blog. Okay? So I hope this isn't all too hard for you after these last couple of lectures. But if it is a bit too hard for you, then it's actually no problem at all, okay? What I really want you to do is to try it. It's not so important if you actually can do it or not. The most important part, believe me, is trying. And I made this challenge a bit complex, a bit difficult on purpose so that you get really challenged. So I could have done something really simple, like just this part here of the layout. So just 3 boxes and then 1 spanning element below, but I think that would have been too simple. You wouldn't have been challenged and then you wouldn't progress. You wouldn't really learn anything new. And so like this, it's a bit more difficult, but then you really have to think and that will move you forward, okay? So I hope you managed to do it, but if you don't, no problem, just move on to the next lecture where I will then show you the solution of this. I hope that you managed to complete the challenge. Now here goes the solution. So once more, we start from an empty CodePen project, and I will start with the markup here once again. So let's call this container a challenge. And so now let's put our elements in there. So the first one is the header. The next one I'm going to call the small box 1. So small box 1, and then actually 3 of them. And I could have done that with Emmet, like I showed you before in the other lecture. But it's only 3 boxes, so it's not too hard. Then the next one is called the main content. Then we have the sidebar. And of course, finally, the footer. Okay, so moving over here to our CSS now. Let's format our challenge element. So let's set like some overall settings like we did before for this container, like giving it a width and a margin of, again, 30 pixels top bottom, and then auto, just so that it sits nicely centered here in our viewport, okay? Then let's actually give a background color to all of these elements here, okay? And how do we do that? How do we select all of them at the same time? Well, I just like to do it like this, as I showed you before many times in the course. So basically we select all of the direct children of the challenge. So using this SAS selector here. So challenge and then direct children and all of them, right? Remember that? So background color, and again I'm going with the orange red, okay? A padding of 20 pixels, let's say. Color should be white. Font size of 30 pixels and the font family, just a sans serif one. So we don't want to bother with incorporating some font here, okay? Just so that it looks a bit better than the original. So this is our layout, let's say, without any of the styling. Now remember that we had 4 columns basically. So one for each of these small boxes and then one on the side for the sidebar, right? So grid, template, rows. And if you remember, we also had 4 rows. And the size I gave them was this one. So 100 pixels for the first one, so for the header. Then 200 pixels for the small boxes. Then 400 pixels for the main content. And 100 pixels again for the footer. And then grid template. Columns. Remember that the sidebar was a bit smaller than the rest of the columns. And so what we want is basically to have 3 equally sized columns and then one smaller one. So the way I'm going about this, and you can probably guess, is to have 3 times 1 fractional unit and then the last column with, let's say, 200 pixels. And so the sidebar will have this 200 pixels, of course, and then the rest of the space will be divided for the 3 other columns and the gutter, of course, that we have. Now what's missing here, you probably already noticed, is to actually make this a grid container. So display grid, and now you will see this making effect. And yeah, we already have now our 4 column tracks and our 4 row tracks as well. Let's just give them some gap so we can see it. So grid gap, 30 pixels. Okay, so you see our 7 grid items here, but we don't see the rest of the rows and the column tracks, right? So let's just inspect this here, such as we did before. And so this is the layout tab here, and so we can now select here the challenge grid container, which is the one here that we're working on. So you see it down here is a representation of the grid that we have. And so here, remember, the rows are 100, 200, 400, and 100. And that's what we can see here. So this is the 100 row, 200, 400, which is much bigger, and then 100. And you see that they are down here. So we see these empty grid cells, which were actually created with our grid track declaration. We just don't have enough grid items to fill all of these cells up. But don't worry, we're gonna care about that right now. Okay, so let's start by positioning our grid items exactly in the cells that we want them to be. So the first thing to do is to make the header span all the way from the first column line to the last one, right? So how do we do that? Well, let's just select the header and then we can use grid column. So we start with number 1. And then remember the trick that we have to go all the way to the end of the grid. So we could just write span over 4 columns, right? but I prefer to do it like this, as I showed you in the last lecture. So from 1 to -1, and so now we have the header going across the entire grid, from left to right, okay? So that part is already done. And notice that we don't actually have to declare the grid row property here, because the automatic placement algorithm takes care of putting the header right in the first line, because it's actually the first element here in a markup as well. So that's automatically placed here, and we don't have to declare it. And the same actually applies to our small boxes here. They're also already exactly where they should be. And so we don't have to do anything, because automatic placement again puts them where we want them to be, okay? So the next thing that we have then to worry about is just the sidebar. So the sidebar should be here in this cell, but not only this cell. So remember that it actually spans across these two cells here, right? So the sidebar should be starting here and then go across these two cells, with the main content then occupying this entire space here on this left side. Okay? So let's code that up very quick. And I'm not really sure why this grid overlay is actually overlaying here this entire CodePen editor. I'm sure that's not really correct, but it's probably just a bug in Firefox right now. So it's not a big deal. All right, so let's worry about the sidebar. And that's actually not correct. So sidebar. So grid column, where is it? It starts, as you can see here, on number 4. So 4 to 5. And we could have used -1 here again to go all the way to the end, but in this case, it's I guess it's not really necessary. So you have the sidebar right here now, but it's not yet exactly where we want it. We want it to be here, beginning on line number 2, right? So grid row, it should go from 2 and then span across 2 cells. So span 2. And that's it. You see? So now it starts here at the top and goes down here. And this is actually all a bit too big, so I have to do all the scrolling up and down. Let me just zoom out a bit. But then actually the code also becomes too small to see probably. But just to get a big overview here of our entire grid, you can see that it's already taking shape and becoming more like what we want in the end. So next what we have to do is to just make this main content here span these 3 cells, and then in the end finally put the footer down here, which also shouldn't be all too hard. Putting it back to its original size, and then let's move on. So main content, and now all we have to do here is to define the column, because the row is actually already correct, right? So you can see that it's already in a correct row, and so all we have to do is to manipulate the position in the column. So it's going to start at number 1, and then I could write once more that it goes to all the way until number 4, but I think it's more intuitive to simply say that it spans across 3 tracks or 3 cells. Okay, and so yeah, that's already looking good. So the main content is now exactly in the place where it should be, and now all there's left to do is to also position the footer. And nothing's easier than that. Grid column, and it's just like the header, so 1 all the way to -1. And yeah, that's it. So that's all we have to do. It's as simple as this, you see? Just a couple of lines of CSS to build this great layout that would have been so complex to build with the old school float layouts, like we've been doing for way too long actually. So let me zoom out here again to see it in its full glory, right? So yeah, so that's the final result, and I really hope that you achieved to do it by yourself. But again, if you did not, don't worry about it. It's no problem. Now worry about it. It's no problem. Now remember that I said in one of the earlier lectures that there are multiple ways of positioning grid items in the grid. And so I want to use this example to demonstrate you the different ways of doing exactly that. So there are basically 2 more ways that I want to show you. And this example is actually, it's really perfect for that, okay? So in the 2 next videos, I'm going to show you 2 different ways which you can also use to position grid items on the grid. So stay tuned for that. Let's now learn how we can position grid items on the grid by naming our grid lines. So what I showed you in the last lecture and the ones before that is how to position grid items on the grid by using the automatically generated grid line numbers, right? But we can actually make our lives a bit easier by naming these grid lines. So let me show you how to do that. But first, let's add a couple of comments here. So method 1, line numbers. And now I'm gonna actually comment out all of this code here and then start from scratch. Well, actually not really from scratch, because I'm gonna copy all of this, but I want to keep the code that we had before so that you can then keep this code for yourself, okay? So this is method 2 with line names. So how do we actually name our grid lines? And actually it's really simple. All we have to do is to use the squared brackets like this. And then in here, put the name of the line. So what we want to do here is to write header start. And the best practice is to basically describe the content that will be in the track. So in this case, between lines number 1 and 2, and then say whether it's the start or the end. Okay? So we have header start, and then in here we will have header end. Okay? And that's actually it. And so now this line number 1 is no longer just called line 1, but it's also called header start. And this one here is called header end. But what about these boxes here now? It doesn't make much sense that this line here is called header end, because it's not just the end of the header, but also the start of these boxes here, right? And so for that reason, we can actually give a line more than one name. So let's call this one here also, let's say, boxes start. Well, let's call it just box start. And then the next one we call box end. Okay? So these are arbitrary names that we come up with, at least the first part here. So in this case here, box. And then we just call the one before the boxes here the start and the one after the end, right? So this row line here is now called header end, and also at the same time box start, while this one here is called box end. Okay? And so now you can probably guess that we're also going to call this one here main start. And then the next one, let's call it main end. And then after that comes the footer. So let's call it footer start. And then the last line is the footer end. And that's it. Let's give it some more space here actually. No, doesn't work. Okay, it's no problem. So we now have all our row lines here named. And actually it's a good practice doing so, okay? So in a professional layout, usually we always name our grid lines like this, and then use these names to position the items in it, okay? And we're gonna do the same thing for the column tracks in a second, but first let me show you how we can actually use these names. And in fact, it's just the same as using the rows, okay? But instead of using the number here, we just use the names. And so remember that this one here starts at this row, which is called boxes start, or box start actually. And it goes all the way until content, or main, I think, main end. So let's take a look. So yeah, this one is called main end. Of course, we could still write span too, but just for the fun of it, let's now make it like this. So main end. And let's see what happens. And yeah, so it's working, right? So it starts here from this grid line, which is called box start, and goes all the way just as it did before until the main end. So this row line, right? And the other ones actually don't really need the grid row declaration. So in fact, we wouldn't maybe really have needed all of these names. Okay, but I still wanted to show you how we do it. Okay, because again, in the future, and when we start building our real project, we're going to do it the same way, and then you will see that it becomes really handy doing it like this. We did it for the row tracks. Let's now also do it for the column tracks. But in here, we have kind of a different situation, right? Because we have this repeat function here, which is going to create 3 column tracks here with this definition here alone, right? So it wouldn't make much sense to put the line name here before this one and then after it, because then only the line before the 3 and after the 3 would get a name. But we want all of them to have a name. So what can we do? Well, we simply put it here right into the repeat. And so we do it like this. And in this case, I'm simply going to call them col, which stands for column, and then start, and then call end. Okay? And what this will do is that it will create a so-called named set of grid lines. So with this, we create 3 columns, and each of them starts with a line called call start and one with call end. And that would mean that we would have conflicting line names, right? And so what happens is that for the first column, it's going to be called call start 1 and call end 1. Then for the second column track, it's going to be called call start 2 and call end 2. And then of course, for the third track, it's going to be called call start 3 and call end 3. All right? And I'm going to show that to you in a second. For now, let's just finish this one here and call it grid end. Okay, and that's actually it. So again, remember that this is a named set of grid lines here. Okay? So when we have these names here, these line names in the repeat, then it's going to create a named set of grid lines. And to show you how to use this in practice, let me show it to you. And so here is the header. And so it goes all the way from the beginning to the end. So what's the first column grid line going to be called? It's call start, and then remember that the first one has the 1. Okay, remember that I just explained that? So this line here is called call start 1. Then this one here is called call end 1, right? And at the same time, it's also called call start 2. And this one here, call end 2, and so on and so forth, all the way here until the end. Okay, so this one is call start 1, here at the beginning. Then we want all the way until the one which is called grid end, I think. Yeah, so grid end. And let's see if that works. And yeah, here we go. So it works just as before. Now we could still use the -1 trick here like we had before, but of course I wanted to show you how to use these column line names, right? Then here with the sidebar, let's do the same. So remember the named set of grid lines works like this. So this is the call end number 3, right? So this line here, okay? So call end 3, and then once more it goes to grid end. And that's it. And now the main content. So this one here. And this one shouldn't be all too hard as well. So call start 1 to call end 3. And let's check that one out. And here you see that it still works the same. So everything is correct. And here again, we want to go from call start 1 to end, or actually grid end. Okay, and yep, so that works as well. All right, and that's actually it. So this is how naming the grid lines works. And again, in more professional layouts, you will usually see it working like this. So we just name all our tracks, both the row tracks and the column tracks, and then use these names to position our grid items to build our designs or layouts. All right, so I hope this made a lot of sense to you. And in the next video, we're going to see the third method of how to position these grid items. So the third method of positioning grid items on the grid is by actually naming entire areas. So let's see how we can do that. So let's again start by commenting out this code here. so that we can again start from scratch. Or actually not really from scratch, but simply by using this code that we had in the first example. Okay. So, method number 3 is to actually name grid areas. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we simply use the grid template areas property. And now this is probably going to look really weird to you, okay? Because I remember that when I first saw this, I found it really strange the way it worked. Okay, but anyway, this is how we name grid areas. So we write a couple of strings, and in there we basically give each grid cell a name. Okay, so in our case we have a 4x4 grid. So in the first string we give the first 4 grid cells 4 names. Okay, and what are our first 4 cells? Well, it's this, 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 and this, right? And all of them are for the header. So let's give them a name, and I'm simply going to call them head. And this is how it works. So head, 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 and head. Okay, so the 4 cells will be called head. And that's because we want the header to be in all of these 4 cells. So basically, this first string defines the first row of our grid. Okay, now we hit enter, then we come here to this exact place. And actually it doesn't have to be this exact place, but I like to do it like this because it's easier to see. And then we need to call the next 4 cells, okay? So this one, this one, this one, and this one. So let's call these 3 here box, and then the last one side. Okay, and so in here I like to use a really small name, like as small as possible, so that it doesn't take too much space up here in the declaration, and so that it's also not too hard to write, because there's usually a lot of repetition. So you see box, 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 and then the last one is side, right? And so basically this template area here, this creates a representation with text of how our final layout is going to look like. So what do we have here in the third row? So basically these 3 cells. Well, all we have here is the main. So main, main, and main, and then on the side we have the sidebar, right? So these 2 here will be the sidebar, these 3 will be the main content, and these 3 will be small boxes individually, right? And then down here, which is the last row, and so it's the last string, we have 4 times the footer. So let's simply use foot here. So foot, 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 and foot. And that's it. So that is our template string. Then at the end, don't forget the semicolon. Okay, so again, this looks a bit weird, I know, but this is actually a great way of placing items on the grid, because it's really simple. Once you have this declaration here finished, then all you have to do is to actually place the items like this. So let's first delete all of this here so that we go back to our initial state. Like this, okay? And so yeah, so this is how it looks like without any placement whatsoever. And so let's now position the header. So remember this grid area property that I showed you before? Back then we used it to put the column start, the column end, the row start, and the row end. So these 4 numbers. Remember that? Right in the first or second lecture of this section, I think. But there is actually another way of using this property here, and that is called for the template areas that we defined here. Okay? So remember that for the header, we called it head. And so all I have to do now is to write head without any quotes here, and that's it. So it places this item here on this entire area that I defined to be the head. So imagine that I put something else here like side, for example, then let's see what's happened. Okay, so now it only occupies these 3 cells here because the head is only in these 3. Okay, that makes sense, right? So let's put it back to head here, and so now you will see it going back. Okay. Then these boxes here, they're actually automatically positioned, such as before. And so let's go to the sidebar. And it's very simple again. We don't have to think like we had to think with the other methods. All we have to do now is to say the name of the area, which is side. And so here we are again with the sidebar exactly where it should be, right? So perfect. The same thing here, main, and the same thing here. And it's actually just foot. And that's it. So layout is complete again. So you see that this is like a completely different philosophy. So in this case, we first think about the layout, so where all of these items should be placed, and then all we have to do is to give the names here to each of the items. While with the two other methods that we did before, we used the names of the lines or the numbers, which is quite similar. And then for each of these items here, we had to think where to position them, right? Now, when we create this template area definition here, we need to be careful and create a complete representation of our grid. Okay, so if it's a bit different at all, then all of this is not going to work. So let me, for example, just delete this here, and you will see that it's not working then at all anymore, right? So this looks just like really weird, okay? So it's not working at all, and just because I didn't really fill up all the 16 cells that we have, right? So we have 4 columns, 4 rows, when 4 times 4 makes 16, and so in here I have to have 16 names, okay? And so let's go back to what we had. Now another thing that we can do here with this template areas is to actually leave empty cells, and all we have to do for that is to instead just delete it, is to put a dot. So let's see what happens then. Well, what happens is that this box here then moves up to this empty cell. And that's because we didn't really position these boxes here, right? And so that's what happens. So if you really wanted to leave this empty, we would have to then place these 3 boxes here. So let's actually do that. That shouldn't be all too hard. So it's small box 1, 2, and 3. And we can probably do this all with the same selector. So 2, and then the number 3. And so grid area should be box. So let's take a look at that. And that's actually not quite what we want, because the template area definition is not really correct. Okay, so what we say here is that this area here should all be the same, which in fact it is not. So let's actually, to make this better, or to make it correct actually, give this different names. And so what we have to do now here, grid area should be box 1. So let's get rid of that. So number 2 for this one. Oh, what's that? And number 3 for this one. And yeah. So now it's correct. Now everything is correct, right? And we have this empty cell here like we defined. And we can put another one, for example, here if we wanted. And then the header would just span these 2 cells. And of course, that's entirely possible. We can have empty cells in our grids without any problem. Okay? So if that's the layout that we're looking for, then CSS Grid gives us the total flexibility to do exactly like that. All right, and that's actually it. So this is all I had to tell you about the naming grid areas and how to position grid items on the grid. So these are the 3 methods, and they can be used in different situations. For example, this one here with the template areas, I think it's really great for smaller layouts like this one. So when I have to build a small layout, then I would always use something like this, because I think it's really straightforward. Okay, so keep that in mind. For a small, simple layout, I would say something like 4x4, 5x5, then it's completely fine to do it like this. But if we have a huge layout like a complete page, maybe with 12 columns or 15 columns and 10 or 15 lines, then it becomes very unpractical to write out all of these areas. It's much simpler to then simply name the grid lines and do it like this, like I showed you in the previous lecture. But for small layouts, again, I think this one here is perfect. Okay, and that wraps up this project. Okay, so project number 2. And I think that you already did a huge progress. So actually, you already know many of the important stuff about CSS grids. You're already ready to build some simple layouts using grids. And that's fantastic, right? Now there's some more advanced stuff to learn, of course, and we're going to do that throughout the rest of the section. But for now, it's great that you've come this far, that you made all this progress, and maybe you can even try to build something right now. Maybe just a small example to see if you got all of this and if you really understood it, okay? Welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to start with another small project in order to learn about the difference between implicit and explicit grids. So again, we start from an empty CodePen here and start by writing some markup, okay? And again, I'm using Emmet here and call these items just item and then the number, such as I showed you before, okay? And this time we want 8 items, and so I just multiply all of this by 8, hit tab, and here we go. So item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Now let's actually add some content here this time, like a sentence, like modern CSS with flexbox and grid is great. So that it's a bit different and not always just with the numbers. Okay, now some styles. And this is the same as usual. Let's say 1000 pixels here again. And let's give it a background color here as well. So a slight gray color again. And since we're here, we can also already style the items here. Okay, and of course we use a nested selector here. We could also do this outside of the container, but it's no problem because the item is actually inside of the container, right? So just padding, let's say 20 pixels. Text color should be white. So I could actually copy this here from the other example as well. But it's just very quick. All right. So that is the quick setup for this small project, a small demo. So let's now add some grid tracks here, and starting with the row. So grid template rows. And what I want to do now is to only add 2 rows and 2 columns. Okay, so that I can show you the difference between explicit and implicit grids. So these rows, they will have a height of 150 pixels. So 2 rows with 150 pixels each, and then 2 columns, and grid template columns. And I want 2 columns with the exact same width, occupying the entire container. So you already know how to do that, right? So I say repeat to 1 fractional unit. And that's it. And actually I could have done the same up here. So actually, why not? So using the repeat function again. And now just to see what's going on here, let's also add a gap. So grid gap, 30 pixels. Oh, and again, I forgot to set the display property here to grid. And so now we'll see what's going on. All right. So we have our grid now here with these 4 cells here that we defined. So we defined a 2x2 grid, remember, which is only 4 cells. But then down here we have the other 4 cells, right? Because we have actually 8 items. And this has actually happened in another project right at the beginning of the section. And I told you by then that we were going to come back to it later. And so now it's that time where we're going to talk about that. So these 4 grid cells that we defined here in the beginning, which are now occupied by these 4 grid items here, this is the so-called explicit grid, because we explicitly defined how these rows and these columns should look like, okay? So again, this part of the grid is the explicit grid. Let's actually inspect this here again. Okay, and so you can see it here as well. So these 4 here, this part of the grid is our explicit grid. Now, if we have more grid items than we have space, well, then CSS Grid automatically adds some more tracks to the grid, so that we can then fit all of these remaining items. And that's what happened here. So you see that down here, these 4, these are 2 row tracks that were added. So this track here and this track, they were added to our grid in order to fit the remaining 4 grid items. And this part of the grid, then these 4 here, this is called the implicit grid. Okay, does that make sense? So again, the first part of the grid, the part that we actually defined in our code, is the explicit grid. So it's this part here defined by these template rows and template columns, okay? So these tracks that we added here. And then the part that is automatically added in order to fit the content that doesn't fit in our explicit grid, CSS adds the implicit grid after that, okay? Now, what if we wanted to somehow style this part of the grid, so the implicit grid? Well, in fact, we can, because there is a property for that. So let's say we want these row tracks here actually to have a defined height. And we can easily do that by using grid auto rows. Okay, and so now we can say that we want like 80 pixels, for example. And that's what it does. So now these 2 automatically added tracks, this one and this one, they have a height of 80 pixels. So let's actually inspect that. So inspect element. And yeah, so you can see it here, that it has a height of 80 pixels, right? And the same goes, of course, for this one, 80, 80, 80 in here. And then the explicit grid that we defined, you can see here that they have a height of 150 pixels. So, perfect. Actually here in this grid inspector, the implicit and the explicit grids, they look a bit different. So you see here that this solid line here goes around the explicit grid. You see that? So the solid line, it actually ends here, right? And so down here, there's no solid line like we have here. So the solid line here is basically the end of the explicit grid. And then also the grid lines in the explicit grids, they are this dashed, while in the implicit grid, they are dotted, like you can see here. I'm not sure if you can see it here maybe in the video, but I'm sure that in your inspector, if you open the DevTools like this, you will see it as well. Okay, so this is just a small subtle difference here in the DevTools. So again, you see that here the lines are dotted like this for the implicit grid, and up here they are dashed. Okay, so just a small subtle difference. Now you may ask, why are these additional grid items that we cannot fit into our explicit grid added as rows and not as columns? Well, that is a great question actually, so let me answer it to you. It's because of a simple small property that is called grid auto flow. Okay, and this property is by default set to row, but we can also set it to column. And check out what happens now. So you see, the remaining items are now no longer added as rows, but as columns, because we told our grid to flow as columns. So you also see that there's a difference in the way that these items are placed. So before we had modern CSS with Flexbox, but now we have modern, then CSS down here with Flexbox. And so what this means is that the automatic placement algorithm now places these items in order to fill up the columns and no longer the rows. So if we set this to row, then you will see that the algorithm automatically places these items into rows. So modern CSS with Flexbox, right? And back to column, then it's modern, and then down CSS with Flexbox, and CSS is great. Okay? Now, if we added more and more grid items here, then we added as new and new columns. Now, of course, if we can style the rows that are automatically added, we can do the same for the columns. So grid auto columns, and let's say we want these to be a half fractional unit. So 0.5 FR, and so they will be half of the width of the other ones here. Okay, so let's check it out. So these one have a width of 303 pixels, And so the other ones should have approximately 150, 151. Yeah, so 151, 667. Okay, makes sense. That's because, of course, half FR is half of one fractional unit, right? So you see that basically this grid auto columns here only applies as soon as we set the auto flow to column, and then this auto rows here for the automatically placed rows is not really relevant. Okay, so that is the difference between explicit and implicit grids. So you see that it's actually not a problem at all. So if we have more items, then we can fit in the grid that we defined initially. So this implicit grid and the ability to style these additional rows and columns is great for use cases where you don't really know how many rows or columns there will be in your grid, in your layout. So for example, if you have an AJAX call in like some web app or something where you can load data from a server while the page is loading, and you don't really know if there are 10 items or 12 or 15 or 20. So if you don't know how many there are, you can simply style these automatically added rows or columns, and then everything is going to work as you expected. So you can control how the grid will look like, even if you don't know how many items there will be in it. In this video, we're going to learn about different ways of aligning grid items to grid areas. Now, before we start, let's actually set this one here back to row, okay, so that our grid items are placed in rows rather than in columns. Okay, and so that the additional items are then placed in the rows. Also, let's add some spanning here to two of these grid items so that I can better show you how this alignment of grid items to grid areas works. So let's do it here for number 4 and number 7. And I do it just as I did before with the SAS way of creating the selectors. So this here will mean item 4, right? So let's give it a different background color, one called crimson, which is like pink, like this. And let's say we want this one to start on the grid row number 2 and then span across 3 row tracks. Okay, so just like this. And you see that it also changed here from the second column to the first column track. And I'm actually not really sure why it did that, but it has to do with the automatic placement algorithm. Okay, so let's move on and do the same with number 7. Also give it a background color and this pink color as well. And then say grid column 1 to -1, so all until the end. All right, and so you see that then it placed the last item here in yet another new created grid track. So you see here on the grid here in the inspector that we now have actually 4 implicit grid tracks. So this, one, this, and this. So 4 implicit grid tracks and 2 explicit grid tracks, right? Remember that from the last lecture? So this is how our grid looks like now. Zooming out a bit so you can see it. Okay, so that's the way that it looks like right now. And so now let me actually show you what I meant with aligning grid items to grid areas. Okay, so basically this is very similar to what we can do in Flexbox with the align items property. And in fact, we have the exact same property here with CSS grids. So let me show it to you. So just like in Flexbox, we apply these properties to the container, to the grid container, which is this one here, of course. So let's add align items, such as we have in Flexbox once again. Now align items is going to align the items across the column axis, okay? So let's set this to center and let's see what happens. All right, that's the result of align items setting to center. And so that's what I meant with aligning the grid item inside of an area. So remember that this one here, what is orange, is the grid item, of course, and the content that's in the grid item, and that is now aligned vertically in the center of this grid area here, right? So this grid area, which is here delimited with these lines. And the same, of course, applies here, because this is now an entire grid area. Remember here, because we spanned this element, so this element number 4, we spanned it across these 3 row tracks. And so this is a grid area, right? And so now this item here is vertically centered inside of that grid area, okay? Now down here you cannot really see a big difference because this grid item is actually almost as tall as this track, okay? So let's change that a bit. So decrease the padding of all the items to 10. And so now you see here that it's also vertically centered here in this area, right? So just as we have it here. Now, why was it stretching all the way from the top of the grid area from here to the bottom of the grid area before we set this align items property? Well, it's because of the same reason that it is in Flexbox, and that's because align items is by default set to stretch. So let me show that to you. So if we set it to stretch, well, then the grid item stretches across the entire grid cell or grid area in this case here. So in this case here, it's a big area, and here as well. So I may write that down here that the default is stretch, but we can also set it to center as I showed you, and also to end, for example. So center, end, and start. So these are the ones that you need to know, okay? These are the ones that are really important. So now you see that each of these items is actually aligned to the end, to the bottom of each of the grid cells or grid areas, okay? So maybe right now you cannot really see a big use case for this or why this is really helpful or useful, but you will see that with practice, this will make a lot of sense. And actually in a big project that we're going to code up next, we will actually use these properties to achieve some of the layouts that we're looking for, that we want, okay? So that is align items. Now we also have something else that we don't have in Flexbox, which is called justify items. So justify items. And we don't have this in Flexbox because Flexbox is not a 2-dimensional layout system like the grid, okay? So we have align items that aligns the items across the column axis, which means vertically, and then we have justify items, which aligns the items across the row axis or horizontally. So let me show that to you with center, and let's put center here as well. And all right, so now with this, the item is actually completely centered inside of the grid cell or the grid area, both vertically and horizontally. So with align items, we align the items vertically, and with justify items, we align them horizontally. Okay, does that make sense? And again, not only in the cells, but also in entire areas. So remember, this one here is an entire area, and let's zoom out a bit here actually. So these 3 cells here, they form an entire area, right? And so now this item here, which says Flexbox, this is centered vertically and horizontally in that entire area, right? So remember, it's an area because we set it here to span across these 3 grid tracks, okay? And then the same, of course, here with number 7. So this entire thing here, these 2 cells, they form an area, these 2. And so now this small item here, which says is horizontally and vertically centered inside of it, okay? So let's put it back to the original size. And then just as before, so where is it? The default here is, of course, stretch. And I'm not going to write it down because it's actually the same as here. So let's put it to start, for example. And that's not right. So start. And now what's going to do is that it aligns them here all the way to the left side. Of course, I could put end. And then it comes here to the right side. So the end of the grid area. So you can play around with this, but I hope it made a lot of sense like this to you. So let's set it back to center here. And yeah. Now, as in Flexbox, where you have the align self property to basically override the align items property for one individual item, we have the same here in Grid. So we have align self and also justify self. So let me show that to you here with the number 4. And let's set this one here to align self. And so what this is going to do is that it will basically override the align items property that is on the grid container. So if we set this one here to start, then only this item here will move to the top, hopefully. And well, it did not. Maybe there's some, I see there's some error somewhere. So let's check that out. Well, it says there's some kind of error, but there's actually not. So let's just delete all of this. And let's try it again. Align self and start. And so this should work. And yeah, so now it works. And so now you see that it's vertically aligned all the way to the top of the grid area. And I could say and then it will move down to the bottom of the area. Okay, so just like this. But let me put it back to start. And so it moves to the top. And now we have the same for the justify. So we can say justify self, and then we have the exact same options here. So let's say start, and so it's gonna move right here to this position, okay? So just like Flexbox, here the self property overrides the overall setting which is set on the container. In Flexbox we only have align self, because again, it's just a one-dimensional layout system, but here in Grid we have align self and then justify self for the horizontal direction. Okay, and that is how we align grid items to grid areas, both horizontally and vertically. Now, if you want to learn how to align entire tracks to the grid container, well, then just move on with me right to the next lecture. So in the last lecture, we learned how to align grid items to grid areas. And so let's now learn how to align entire grid tracks to our grid container. Now, before we can do that, we actually need to make a couple of changes here. And let me start by adding a comment here. So align grid items to grid areas. And so next we're going to learn about align grid tracks to grid container. And this one here, of course, should be in here. So let's put this all together a bit. Okay, and now what I need to change is actually the columns here, because I no longer want them to occupy the entire container, because then I cannot really show you how all of this works. Okay, so let me comment this one out here. Or I can actually just copy it. And so let me put it here where we learn about this. So let's say I just want 150 pixel wide colors, or maybe 200. Okay, and actually let's also comment out this one here from the last lecture, so that makes it a bit more easier to understand. Okay, just like this. Maybe we can also decrease the rows a little bit. So let me change that as well. So let's say 100 pixels. Now we already have a width here of the container, which is these 1000 pixels, right? So let's also just set the height of the container to 1000 pixels. Okay, and so now you see that the container actually continues down here and then also here on the side of the grid. Okay, so basically our entire container is this. So all of this is our container, but our grid tracks, they only occupy this part of the container. Okay, and so all the rest here is empty. And so now we're ready to actually align the tracks to the container, which is the goal of this lecture, right? So what do I actually mean with that? So let me show it to you. And I'm going to start with justify content. And again, this property exists in Flexbox. And it actually works the exact same way. So this is going to align the tracks inside of the container across the row axis, so horizontally. So let's set it to center. And here we go. So it moved right to the center of the container. And so just as we center flex items inside of a flex container with justify content, we do it the exact same way with the grid tracks here in CSS Grid. Okay, so this is what we will use if we want to really center the entire content basically of the grid inside of the container. Now there are other values, of course, just like in Flexbox, and actually there are the exact same possibilities. So one is center, as I just showed you. Then of course there is start, which we already saw how it looks like. So just like this. Then there's end. So let me write down the options here for you. And then, beside these three very basic ones, there are the ones that we also have in Flexbox. So we have space between. And so let me actually write it here as well. So space between, and see what happens now. So it pushed each of the columns to one of the sides of the grid container, right? So basically it divided all of the empty space here between these two columns. So these two tracks. And so that's the exact same behavior as in Flexbox with space between. Now we also have space around. And so, as you would expect, it works just the same way as in Flexbox. So basically the space on the left side is the same as on the right side. So basically it's like this square here. And then here in this grid track here, it's the exact same thing. So the same space here on the right side as on the left side, which makes it so that the space here in between these two is double the space than we have here on both the left and the right side. So let me write down the option for you here again. And then the last one here is space evenly. And what this is going to do is that the space is now all the same here and here and here. So the space between the items is the exact same space as on the left and the right side of each of the items. Okay, so these are different possibilities to build different types of layouts. Now, we also have, of course, justify items. Now, if we can horizontally align these tracks, then of course we can do the same vertically, right? And so what we do for that is align content. Okay, and so let's start again with center here, because I think that's always the most useful. And so you see that now all of it moved into the middle of the container vertically. And let's zoom out a bit again to see this happening. Okay, just like this, maybe just like this, yeah. So you have this entire container here, and now we see that our tracks here, or rows, they're now vertically inside of this gray container. So let's actually remove this here so you can see it a bit better. And yeah, so you see that exactly happening. Turn it back on, and yeah. And let's go back to the size that we had. Okay, and then in here you have actually all the exact same options as you have here in justify content. So let's just set this one here to center as well. And so, well, what's going on here now? The semicolon is missing. And yeah, so now it's completely centered here. So both vertically and horizontally inside the container. And you see that it kind of adds these huge gutters here at the top and on the left side here in order to put us here in the center of the grid, right? But that doesn't really matter. It's just to see how Grid actually handles this centering. So let's try just, for example, end, moving it down all the way to the end. Yeah, just like expected. Or let's try space between as well. So let's see what that does. And yeah, so it's the exact same thing as it does with justify content. So basically the space between all of these row tracks are now the same, so that it occupies the entire height of the container. Then of course space around. So that also works the same way. Okay. So the space here on top is the same as half this space here. Well, it doesn't really look like that, but well, it should be like that. Okay, so let's go back to center here, because again, that's actually the most useful case. So basically, if we want to center all of our items inside of a grid container, that's how we do it. We set justify content and align content to center, and that's it. Okay, so you see that basically whenever we have items here in the property name, so align items and justify items, that is for the individual items. And if we have content here in the property names, like we have in justify content and align content, then it means that it's going to align the entire tracks. Then the align part of the name always means the vertical direction or the column axis. So that's the same. So align content and also align items means the vertical direction, so the column axis. And at the same time, justify always means that it's the horizontal direction, so the row axis. both for justify items and justify content. So that is the logic behind these names, and I think that's helpful to memorize and to understand what each of these 4 properties does. Okay, so I hope that this makes sense to you and that you fully understand how we can place our items and our tracks exactly where we want them to be inside of the grid container. So now there's just one more small thing that I want to show you in this small demo project. And so let me just add a small change here to one of these items. So let me style the item number 6. Let's give it a background color of light coral. And then make it span across 2 row tracks. So grid row and span 2. So let's see how that looks like. And so yeah, so it spans now these 2 rows. And then what I wanted to create here is this empty cell. And this empty cell here comes from the fact that the automatic placement algorithm, it kind of tries to keep the sequence of these items here in the source code. It tries to kind of follow that when it places the grid items on our grid. And so sometimes that can create this kind of holes here, okay? And we not always want them. And so let me show you how we can actually fix that. Let's just take this out here so we can see it a bit better. And let me also take off this because it overlays here all our code. I'm not really sure why, but it looks better like this. Okay, so let me actually zoom out here a bit again. And so this is our grid, and this is here the hole basically in the grid that I was talking about. And again, that's because the automatic placement algorithm, it tries to keep these 8 items here that we have kind of in order. Okay, so it tries to follow that order. But if we want to fix that, we can actually do it, and it's very easy. It's very simple. All we have to do is to come here to this property, to grid auto flow. And in here we defined that it should flow in rows, right? So that the items should be placed in rows and not in columns. Now all we have to do here is to add the dense keyword. Okay, and so with this we say that we actually want no holes in there and that we want a more dense grid. So with no holes, all the items packed so that all the grid cells are filled with some kind of item, okay? So let's take a look at that again. And so now you see that the track that we had down here is now gone. So let me take that out again to show it to you. And you see, so now we had this additional track here, then this hole, and then this here you can also call a hole. So another cell without any item in there, okay? And so if we set it back to dense, you will see that now this one here, which set great, it's now moved to this place, which was empty before. Okay, and this can be useful sometimes, like if we have an image gallery or something like that. So we may place some images in different grid cells in order to make a good looking grid of images. And then sometimes they may be like some kind of hole. And then we just use the dense keyword in order to fill that hole and end up with a dense, full packed grid like this one without any holes. Okay, so that was just another quick thing that I wanted to show you. And so now we're actually done with this small demo project. So again, you're moving on with a great pace. You already have most of the fundamentals that it takes to start building real-world grid layouts. There's just a couple of more advanced things that we have to learn, and we're going to do that over the next couple of lectures. Okay, so we're going to start another very small demo project, and then I'm going to teach you a little bit more advanced stuff in there. Okay, so if you want to do that right now, then let's move on together right to the next video. Welcome to the last small demo project in this first intro section of CSS Grids. So in this lecture, we're going to learn some more advanced topics, including min content, max content, and also the min-max function. So let's go straight to it. So once again, we start here from an empty code pen, but actually let me go back to the one that we created in the last couple of lectures and actually copy our markup here. Okay, so I want the exact same HTML, and also I'm going to take all of the CSS here and then remove what I don't want. Okay, just so we can save some time instead of having to write out the same stuff over and over again. Okay, So I'm going to remove all of this. And okay, and so now we're ready to start from a clean state. Actually, one thing that I wanted to do is to give each of these items a different background color so that we can better distinguish what we're going to do in this lecture. Okay, so number one, and then let me just copy this part in here, and then I'm going to create 8 of these. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And this one we don't need. And the colors that I selected for them are called yellow, green. This one is called blue, violet. Then this is pale violet, red. Yeah, exactly. Then royal blue, goldenrod, crimson, and finally dark slate gray or something like that. Dark slate gray. All right. So let's now define our explicit grid, okay? And I hope you remember from the last couple of lectures what an explicit grid is. So it's just the one that we define with the template rows and template columns, okay? So the first thing, display grid. And then let's give this just 2 rows. So grid template rows. And I want them both to be 250 or 150 pixels high. Okay, so that's what we see down here. And you see that then the other 6 items here, of course, they are added into the implicit grid. Okay, so because right now we only define 2 cells, and so the remaining ones are then added to the implicit grid that we didn't define. All right, so let's now define the columns. And here is the new thing. So far we have only used like real units here in these column definitions or the row definitions. So like pixels, percentages, or the fractional unit. So something like this. So we could do 1FR, 1FR, and 1FR, or of course a repeat. So repeat 4 and then 1FR. That would be the same, but I want to show you something now, and so I did it like this. So up until this point, we always used these normal units here. But there are some new keywords that are associated with CSS grids that we can use here instead. And the first one that I want to show you is called max content. So instead of having here a real unit, let's just add max content and see what happens. Okay, and so now you see that the first track, so the first column track here, which is this one, of course, has the exact width so that it can accommodate here this content. Okay, so this is the largest content that we have in this column, and so therefore that becomes the width of this entire column. Okay, and so that's what the max keyword does here with the columns. It makes this column as wide as it has to be to fit this content. And in fact, max content also tries not to make any line breaks. So let's also add max content here to the last one, and so now it has the width of this word flexbox. But now let's see what happens if we add a bunch of text here to this last field here, this last cell. So let's see, modern CSS with flexbox in grid is great and amazing and just awesome to work with. Okay, so a bunch of text. And you see what happened now? It expanded this column and it became really wide. Because as I mentioned, it tries to make the column as wide as possible without having to cause any line break in the content. Okay, and so that's exactly what happened here. And then of course the remaining space, so this one here in the middle, is then divided in for these 2 columns. So the 1FR and 1FR are these 2 columns here. So that's the remaining space. Now in this case, this doesn't make much sense here for us, right? And so let's actually change this. And what we can do is to, instead of writing max content, to just put min content. So that's another keyword that was introduced with CSS Grid and that we can use here. And so what happens now is that the column track takes the largest width that is needed to fit this content without overflowing. But actually it does overflow a bit down here, right? So the column is just the width of this awesome word here, right? So that's the minimum width that this column has to have in order to fit the content, so without overflowing here on the sides. But now, as we define the rows with a height of 150 pixels, this content doesn't really fit anymore into the height, right? And so what we can do is to use min content or max content also on the rows. Okay, so let me show that to you. So let's just get rid of that one and put a new one down here. And then instead of saying that the height should be a fixed 150 pixels, let's put min content here as well. And let's see how that works out. And all right, now all of this text fits in the height and also the width of this grid cell here, right? Now what also happened is, of course, that this first row here now also has just the min width to accommodate, to fit the text here. So in this case, this is just one line. Let's just increase this a little bit, like modern, I don't know, something like this. So actually this column just got wider because we have max content here. But if you put this to min content, then you would see that this happens, right? So now the column is just as wide as necessary to fit one of these words, and then the row track also expands in order to fit all of this content in there, okay? Now let's get rid of that. This was just to show you even further how this works. And now in this case, it's really not so different to having max or min here, because it's just one word anyway, and so there's nothing to break, nothing to overflow. So this is how max content and min content work. Does it make sense to you? Now suppose that we really wanted this first row track here to be 150 pixels high, not just the min content, so not just to fit these words that we have here. So we could hard code it like this. So grid template rows, and we could say 150 pixels here and then min content. And then this would kind of work the way we wanted it to be, right? But now just suppose that for some reason we add all of this text here to this cell, or actually not to this one, actually to this one here. And so now you see that it actually overflows. So it again no longer fits, right? So let's go back and let me tell you the solution to this problem. And the solution is to use something called the min-max function, okay? So let's get rid of this one here and again add a new one based on the one that we had before, okay? So what is the min-max function? Well, basically the min-max function is just something that we pass two values in, and then CSS ensures that the track will always stay between these two values. So imagine that we pass into the min-max function 100 pixels and 200 pixels for a column. And so CSS Grid will ensure that no matter what happens, this grid column will always stay between 100 and 200 pixels width. Okay, so let me show that to you in practice with this example. And so we write min-max and we say that the rows should be at least 150 pixels and at most min content. Okay, and that is exactly what we were talking about before. So this is what we want. So again, we want the row to be at least 150 pixels high. So that's happening here in this first row, right? Let's give it some more space here. So that is happening here. So this one has now 150 pixels again, but the second one is larger. And that's because we allow CSS Grid to size somewhere between 150 pixels and the min content. Okay, and if we were now to remove this text here, so I'm going to cut it and put something else, like just grade, like it was before, then you see that it is now 150 pixels high, right? So let's put that back, and you will see that it now grows again. And the same thing if I put it here into this pink cell. So let's see. And all right, so now it grew in order to accommodate, to fit all of this content again. So does that make sense? Let me actually give you maybe a more easy to understand example with some columns now. Okay, so let's get rid of all of this huge text that we put here. And so let's get back to the old sentence that we had before, so that I can now show you some other examples using the min-max function with the columns. Okay, so let me just put a comment here using min content and max content, And now let's do this all again. And now let's do another part here of the code where we use the minmax function. Alright, so let's say that we want the first column to always be between 200 and 300 pixels. Okay, so grid template columns, and we can now use the minmax function to say exactly that. So the minimum should be 200 pixels and the maximum 300 pixels. And then the other ones should just fill up the remaining space. So we can use repeat and 3, 1 FR. So nothing new here, right? So let's check this out now here with the inspector again. And so, yeah, so you see that now this column has actually 300 pixels of width, right? Now, in order to see this a little bit better, we should actually give this container a relative width so that we can play around here with the viewport width, okay? So right now the width is 1000 pixels, but let me just specify a new one here. And let's say 90%, so that's going to override then the 1000 pixels, okay? And so now if we play around here with this viewport width, we can actually see what will happen. So let's do that. And you see that nothing changes this far. So let's inspect it again. So this one has still 300 pixels and these other ones are a lot smaller. So let's decrease this even further. And now you see that it started to change. You see? So now it has a width of 200 pixels. And we can put it somewhere in between. And now you see it has 230. Okay, now it has 271. But it always stays between 300, as it is now, and 200. So even if we make this even really small, so you see that now the grid doesn't even fit anymore, but the first column, it's never less than 200 pixels. So you see that? It is still 200 pixels. And no matter what we do, this will always be the minimum width of this column. Okay? So this is really powerful here with Grid. The minmax function is a great addition, and we're going to use it all the time actually. And there are some great techniques that I'm going to show you also in the next video where it comes in really handy. So let's look at another example, because this can be different from pixels, of course. So let me put 50% here. Okay. And so, yeah, so now you see that it is 50% here of this entire column. So let's see the size. So the container has 1007 pixels, and so this one has 503, which is half of the entire width. And so if we now start decreasing this, then of course the first column track also decreases, but it still always has 50%. So you see, the total is 680, and so this one is 340, right? But at some point, there will come a point where this is no longer true. So where it's no longer 50%, but 200 pixels, right? Because we said that it should never be less than 200 pixels, right? So just like before. And just another example, we can of course also put the fractional unit here, okay? And so then at this state, it is the same width as all the other columns, but as we start decreasing it, at some point you see that it fixes at these 200 pixels, while all the other ones then divide the remaining space by these 3 columns, right? So this one stays at 200 no matter what happens, and then these take up the remaining space. Now, one interesting thing that we can see here is that this column here is actually larger than this. And actually these 3 have all different width, okay? Even if we set them all to 1 fractional unit. So we said that they should be all the same, that they should be all 1 fractional unit. And this behavior actually confuses a lot of people, but it really shouldn't, because it's really straightforward. So the CSS Grid specification says that a fractional unit fills up the entire remaining space, but it is never smaller than the minimum content of a row or a column. Okay, so ideally these 3 columns here should be all the same because they're all 1 FR. But at the limit, when this content here gets too wide, then this fractional unit simply takes the minimum width that it needs to fill the column without overflowing. Okay, so that's just an interesting fact that confuses a lot of people, but now it's not going to confuse you. Okay, so let's get back to the original size here. And yeah, so now you know how the minmax function works, how main content and max content work, and that's all that I had to show you in this lecture actually. Now in the next lecture we're actually going to take this a step further and bring even more stuff into this grid definition here, so that we can build truly advanced layouts, okay? But for now, I really hope that you understand all of this, what we just learned in this lecture, and only if you really did, you should then move on right to the next video with me. In this lecture, you will learn all about the autofit and autofill keywords, and also how to build truly responsive layouts with them without writing a single media query. So let's get rid of this code that we have here. And add a new comment here. So using autofill and autofit. Okay, and actually we want the rows back. Okay, so that we have our 150 pixels row. So we're also back to the 1000 pixel container here. Okay, so just like we have defined here, and that's better to show you how autofit and autofill actually work. Okay, so where and how do we use these keywords? So let me show it to you. So grid template columns. And so what we usually did was to use the repeat keyword, right? Then put some number in here, like 4, and then say, for example, 1 fractional unit, right? And that then translates to something like this. But what if we didn't want to specify this exact number here? What if we simply wanted to adapt this to the number of items that we have? So for example, let's put 100 pixels here. Edit now is going to create 4 columns, each with 100 pixels. But imagine that we wanted to have 8 columns here. But instead of writing 8, we wanted this to happen automatically. And that is where autofill comes in. So instead of a number here, we can write autofill, and then CSS Grid is automatically going to create 8 tracks for us. And actually, in fact, it's not just 8 tracks, it creates 10 tracks. Okay, let me show that to you here with the inspector. And so here you see the 10 column tracks. And why 10 and not 8? Well, that's because our container is 1000 pixels, as you can see, and we specified that we wanted 100 pixel columns. And so 1000 divided by 100 is of course 10. And therefore, it then creates 10 column tracks. And then after that, it actually puts our items in there also, of course. Okay, does it make sense? So again, what autofill here does is that it automatically creates as many tracks with the desired width that we specify here as fit into the container. And in this case, that's 10 tracks, okay? Because 1000 divided by 100 is 10. Now, what's different then between autofill and autofit that I'm going to show you next? So autofill does it like this, and autofit does it like this, okay? So what happened here? What's the difference? Well, it actually still created the 10 columns. And we can see that here by the last line number, which is 11. And so this means that the grid actually has 10 columns. So we can see that it's 10 columns because it ends here still at number 11. But what autofit does is that it actually collapses these tracks and gives it a width of 0, creating then this extra space that we see here. Okay, so basically it is as if it only created really 8 tracks, right? And actually down here you can see that it's only like 8 column tracks, right? So it creates these tracks and then leaves this empty space here, which we can then fill if we want it. Okay, and so that's the big difference. With autofill, it actually creates 10 columns, so as many as fit in here, while with autofit, it still creates these 10 columns, but then collapses the ones that are empty to have a width of 0. Okay, and so what this allows us to do is something really great. So let me copy this here and put it here. And so this allows us to use the min-max function in here, like this. So min-max, it should be at least 100 pixels, but it can be up until 1 fractional unit. So watch what happens now. And here we go. So now it occupied our entire grid here. So our entire grid container, right? So basically filling that extra space that was left over by expanding these columns into more than 100 pixels of width. Now, to show this even better to you, let's go back to having the width of 90%. 90%. Okay. And so now let me show you what happens as we decrease this. So right now the container has 1007 pixels of width. So, and now I start reducing, and watch what is going to happen. So right now we have 831 pixels, and so we can still fit the 8 columns in there, right? Because each column has to be at least 100 pixels here, right? So 100 pixels has to be the minimum of each column. And right now we have 830 pixels. So we can still fit the 8 columns in here. But what happens if I decrease this even further? And so here you see it. The last grid item moved into the next line. And that's because right now we only have 7 columns here. So let's check it out. And yeah, you see that we only have 796. So it's almost 800, but it's no longer really 800. And so we can no longer fit 8 columns here with 100 pixels each, right? Because for that we would need 800 pixels. And so what AutoFit here does then is that it simply creates, instead of 8 columns, 7 columns. And so that's actually what you see down here. So now you'll no longer have 8 columns, but 7. And as you can imagine, this will keep happening as we decrease this even further. So let's now actually, instead of 100 pixels, put 200 pixels here. Okay, so what's going to happen then? Well, instead of having 8 columns, we have 5. And that's because right now we have 1007 pixels. And as you see, 1007 divided by 200 pixels fits approximately 5 columns. All right. And so we have 5 columns now, with each of them with 201 pixels wide. As we decrease this, this is what happens. So we no longer have enough space for the 5 columns. And so we end up with having only the 4 columns. And so each one has 240 pixels, so which is still well above our 200 limit. So not this one here again. So let's decrease this even further. And so you see what happened? It changed it from 4 to 3 because it no longer has the space now. So again, 797, it no longer fits 4 columns of 200 because for that we need 800, which we don't have anymore. And so we only have 3 columns. Okay, and now actually you see that it started here a 3rd line. So let's actually format that as well. So do you remember how that works? So grid, auto, rows. And remember we had a 150 pixels, and so let's continue with that. And all right, so now you see that all of these have 150 pixels of height. So let's decrease this even further. And at some point, you can guess it, we end up with a 2-column layout, which is now 2 by 4. And as you can starting to see, this is really a flexible, adaptive layout, right? So really responsive without writing a single media query. So this is absolutely fantastic and really useful. And so this trick that we have here in this line with this AutoFit and then the minmax between a fixed number and a 1FR, that is a huge trick that we can use and will use to build our layouts, which will then automatically adapt to the screen size without us having to worry about anything, without having to write any media query or anything like that. Okay, now let's decrease it even further. And now it's really a 1-column layout. So really like a completely responsive layout for like a small phone or something like that. Okay, and so it created these 8 rows now, all with 150 pixels as we specified, in 1 column. Okay, so you see this is really responsive, really adaptive to our screen width. Okay, so I didn't just want to throw this line of code here without explaining how everything works. Instead, we built up from the beginning, first learning how the minmax function works, then how autofill and autofit work, and then finally we brought it all together to learn how to build these adaptive, these responsive layouts without writing a single line of a media query. Okay, so Grid allows us to do this. And once again, this is a huge step forward for CSS, and it makes it so much easier to code our designs or layouts using CSS Grid. Okay, so I hope that you understand this. You can again play around with this if you want. And if you want to see my code, actually, so these 4 examples that we just coded in this section all you have to do is to come here to my profile, which is here codepen.io/myname. And then here in the public pens, you will have the ones that we coded in the section, part 1, 2, 3, and 4, to review the code if you want. Or of course, if you coded along with me during these videos, then you have your own code to play around with, and you can make some changes and play around with this until everything makes a lot of sense. All right. So at this point, we actually covered almost everything there is to know about CSS Grid. So you could already start building your own CSS Grid layouts without having to watch any more videos. But I decided, of course, that I want to add yet another project to this course. And so in the next section, we will start an entire new project built from scratch using CSS Grid, so that you can use and apply all of what we learned here in the section to a real-world project. Because knowing how all of this works is one thing, but then applying it to a real-world context is something really different, okay? And so that's why I added a new project that we will build together in the next section. So I hope that you're really as excited as I am for that. And so after you're ready playing around with all of this, then I hope to welcome you to the next section and to start a project with you.